Welcome back. A story that once seemed like it only existed on internet conspiracy forums has now become nationwide news. Ghislaine Maxwell, the former companion to American financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, was found guilty of conspiring with him to recruit, groom, and sexually abuse underage girls as young as 14 years old. Joining me to discuss the verdict is President of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Neama Rahmani. Neema, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, this is a huge story, and to fully understand the weight of this victory, we need to understand how this actually began. So, for those who don't know, can you briefly tell us about the controversy surrounding Jeff Epstein and now Ghislaine Maxwell?
And Jeffrey Epstein was one of the richest and most powerful men in America, and he was connected to Hollywood celebrities like Kevin Spacey, members of the royal family like Prince Andrew, and even former presidents like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. And he is alleged and was convicted of sexually abusing young women. Before he could really receive federal criminal justice, he was arrested, but he was found dead in his cell. Some folks think he was killed, while the official reports say that he committed suicide.
Now, the New York Times reports Maxwell's trial was widely seen as the courtroom reckoning that Epstein never had. As you mentioned, Epstein was found dead, but if he had gone to trial, is it possible he would have seen the same charges for these crimes?
No question. He would also be looking at sex trafficking charges. He was arrested and charged in Florida many years ago, but when Alex Acosta was United States attorney there, he gave him a very controversial state disposition where he served some limited time in county jail, but he was allowed out to work. And ultimately, Alex Acosta was appointed to be the Secretary of Labor under former President Trump, but he had to resign when word of this settlement became public.
Now, Maxwell was found guilty on five of the six counts. She now faces up to 40 years for sex trafficking of minors, 10 years for another count, and so much more. She is looking at decades in prison. However, it's alleged that Maxwell's team plans to appeal. Can you explain how that will change the outcome of this verdict?
I don't expect her conviction to be reversed on appeal, but that is her only chance of getting a reduced sentence. Highly unlikely that the Second Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals, reverses her conviction. But her really other only legal alternative is to cooperate and start naming names. And her family has made it clear that she maintains her innocence despite being convicted and that she's not going to identify others who participated in sexual acts with Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, we often hear about repeals in cases where someone feels they were wrongly convicted, but can you just explain how that actually works?
Well, it's always possible for someone to be wrongfully convicted, but there's an overwhelming amount of evidence against Ghislaine Maxwell. There's no question that she was very close to Jeffrey Epstein. And four different accusers came to court and testified about sexual acts involving Jeff Epstein, which Maxwell also participated in.
Now, like you mentioned a little bit, you don't believe Maxwell has legal basis to appeal. Can you just further explain why?
Well, the primary basis for her appeal will be what we call prior Badax witnesses. And we've seen this in the recent Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein cases, where some jurors have a difficult time believing the testimony of one victim and testifying and convicting on that basis. They need more. So, what the government did in this particular case is to put victim after victim after victim to testify that Maxwell was engaged in misconduct. And at least one of those victims was 17 and of age. And the basis for Maxwell's appeal is that because she was of age, she should not have testified as a prior bad acts witness.
Wow. Now, one concern some people have revolves around Maxwell's cooperation, and you kind of mentioned that a little bit. What does cooperation mean in the courtroom, and how does does it actually even absolve the criminal from their punishment?
It does not, but it can be a basis for a lesser or reduced sentence. So, under the federal sentencing guidelines, it's a point based system, and you can get points off for cooperation. Now, Maxwell first has to cooperate, start identifying other individuals, they need to be prosecuted, and she ultimately may need to testify either before the grand jury or at trial in those prosecutions. And if she does, then she may get points off her sentence. But the government is going to be very hesitant to offer any type of lenient sentence or slap on the wrist because of the perception that Jeff Epstein never received the criminal punishment that he deserved.
No, I love that you mentioned the whole idea of like slap on the wrist, and some people say, call it giving someone a free pass. I think it's important to note that in these cases with high profile people, a lot of people do often believe that they kind of get away with murder or get away with doing things that they probably shouldn't. Can you just explain the importance of like not giving free passes despite your social class or your standing in society?
Well, there is rightfully a public perception that Jeffrey Epstein did not receive the sentence that he deserved because of his money and because of his influence, and that he was allowed to victimize so many young women. So, obviously, there's been a shift in society. Women that have been victims before have come forward. They are now empowered, and it's time to hold individuals like Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and those who participate in these acts with them accountable in a way that our criminal justice system has not for decades.
Now, I love that you mentioned that because that kind of goes into my next question. I think this guilty verdict is a victory for many because these are very powerful people that we're talking about. And we've seen something similar with Weinstein, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly, and now this situation. One of the victims, Annie Farmer, states that this demonstrates that no one is above the law. What do you think this is saying about our current state of our justice system? And are we changing as a society?
We are. And the fact that prosecutors are taking these challenging cases where young women have been victimized. Let's not forget, R. Kelly was acquitted the first time he was tried. Bill Cosby, the first time he was tried, that jury hung. Weinstein's victims suffered for many years before he was finally brought to justice. And Jeffrey Epstein, even though he's dead, I'm glad that the Department of Justice and prosecutors are finally holding Ghislaine Maxwell and others who may have participated with him accountable.
And regarding the way we as society discuss sexual assault, do you think the general public influenced this in some way? Because in the beginning, I stated that this, like, it seemed like it only existed online where people kind of talked about these things. So, do you think the general public influenced this kind of decision in some way?
It does, because for these prosecutions to be successful, victims have to come forward. They have to testify. And part of the psychology of a sexual abuse victim is that it's challenging for them to do so. Sometimes they don't report it right away, and years pass because they're ashamed or they blame themselves. But ultimately, they have no one to blame but their victim. And as women come forward, they tell their story. That empowers and encourages others to do the same thing, and that's how these prosecutions can be successful.
Now, do you feel Epstein's victim is receiving some sort of justice through Maxwell's conviction?
No question that Maxwell's conviction is a vindication for the four victims who testified. They had to get in front of a jury and tell their story of abuse in a very public way. So they were victimized once again. And the fact that those 12 jurors returned a guilty verdict really is a vindication for them and everyone else who has been abused by Jeff Epstein.
Now, moving forward, it's a lot of talk about, the abusers, but I want to focus on the victims a little bit more. What are some ways that you can support victims through this? Although this is a victory, I'm sure they may be feeling something else. What is some way that we can continue to support victims of these type of situations?
Well, there are many organizations that are set up to help victims of childhood sexual abuse across a wide variety of states. And these women have also retained lawyers. They've engaged in civil litigation and lawsuits against Jeffrey Epstein and his estate. At least one victim or alleged victim has sued Prince Andrew, alleging that he participated in the abuse. There's been others who have been named as well. And really, just the social media rallying around these women, supporting them, it has helped them come forward and tell their story in a way that, frankly, they just weren't comfortable doing so in the past.
And I'm really happy to hear that. And I'm really happy as a society that we are changing and that more people are feeling, confident enough to talk about this. Now, I want to ask you, how can people stay up to date with you and to learn more about just learning about these cases in general?
Yeah, please follow us on social media, westcoasttriallawyers.com at West Coast Trial Lawyers or West Coast Trial on Instagram and Twitter, respectively. We talk about all these cases and we cover them as they're happening. So you can stay up to date on our criminal justice system and how victims are finally having their voice heard.
And lastly, I want to ask you your personal opinion on just the outcome and, were you glad to see that, more and more people are speaking out and these people are actually kind of getting the things that they deserve?
I'm incredibly happy. I've been practicing for 20 years and I've handled a lot of crimes against women. And I've seen a clear shift right now that these powerful men that used to take advantage of their sex and their money and their position, they're finally being brought to justice in a way that frankly hasn't happened and when I started my legal career.
All right, Nima, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about such an important topic.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.